Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a lecturer, a climate corruption reporter, and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and political crises that we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. My guest this week is Rupert Read. Rupert is an associate professor of philosopher at the University of East Anglia. He's the author of Parents for a Future and the founder of the Moderate Flank Incubator. Rupert was a member of Extinction Rebellion. He was part of the original crowd that managed to launch it into the public consciousness. And most of his work is around the climate and eco-philosophy and how to develop visions of the future, how to develop agency, how to get people acting in the way that we all need to in order to save our future from the nightmare of neoliberalism that is not only driving people all around the world into poverty, but is also causing huge environmental destruction. Rupert has been thinking about all of these problems and working on all of these problems for such a long time, so it was such a pleasure to speak with him. We discussed counter-histories, we discussed how to envision different futures. He introduced to me, at least, the difference between dystopias, utopias, and through-topias. We discussed the notion of truth and how to tell the truth, what kinds of truths need to be iterated. We spent a long time discussing agency, as I've already mentioned, and brilliantly, towards the end of the episode, Rupert gives a long list of initiatives that are happening all over the United Kingdom for people who want to get involved in climate action. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. If you're loving the show, support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com or on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. By signing up, you'll also get access to the weekly article I write inspired by each interview. Thank you to everyone who has signed up and is supporting the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Rupert, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. Pleasure to have you on the show.
Very good to be here.
So you are a professor at University of East Anglia. What are you a professor in? What do you teach?
So I teach philosophy. These days, it's mostly eco-philosophy and political philosophy that I teach, and some philosophy of science, thinking about the precautionary principle, that kind of thing.
What is the precautionary principle?
The precautionary principle says that when there is a threat of sufficient magnitude, then we don't need to have full certainty about that threat before moving to meet it. It's the precautionary principle, for example, that led the EU to ban certain pesticides, even though they weren't completely proven to be devastating to bees. Because the idea is, well, if a threat is sufficiently serious, if you wait until you know for certain whether the threat is actual or not, you may have waited far too long. If we acted more on the precautionary principle, basically, we wouldn't be in the terrible mess that we're in.
That is, I had never come across that. It's funny, I was just thinking about, you've just given me the name for something that I was thinking about yesterday with regards to journalism. And journalism needs to start taking a position of advocacy in the face of, the existential crisis that we face because of the climate crisis. Right, so let's kind of stick on that. Who decides with the precautionary principle? It is people in power. Is that the problem?
It's people in power, yes, as usual. But I think there's a broader problem, which is that this principle in acting in a precautious way is unfortunately not something that we're very good at doing as a society as a whole. Arguably, that hasn't always been the case. In ancient cultures, in indigenous cultures, there were various kinds of practices that primed people to think really long term and to be really careful about doing anything that could be majorly devastating to their ecosystems or their societal infrastructure. But we've moved to a way of living over the past few centuries, especially, where we tend not to think like that. We tend to think, well, progress is a good thing. Technology is progress. The more of it, the better. Let's roll. And then we deal with the consequences later. So I think the problem is a lot broader and deeper than just the fact that we've got a lot of short-termist politicians who don't take thinking green and thinking planet sufficiently seriously. It's that the culture, the civilization we're in as a whole, has got some work to do to get to the kind of place where we're thinking of the seventh generation, where we're thinking, what if something really goes wrong here, where we're thinking beyond relatively narrow, short-term, often financial interests.
Let's stick on this as well, because one of the things I noticed is that you write this sort of these counter histories. What would the world look
Yeah.
like if, you know, um, and so do we have an idea of the moment that things started to go wrong, when we started to perhaps move away from having a long-term understanding of our relationship with our environment? I had Carl Safina on the show about a year ago now,
Oh, yeah.
and he pointed the finger at Plato and Plato's concept of
Right.
profanity. He was like, that was, we took a wrong turn.
Yeah. God, what a great question. It's a huge question, though, of course. I think there are various moments one could point to. Yeah, I think that there have been problematic moments in the history of philosophy, for sure, but I think
Mm,
probably of greater significance has been the onset of the Industrial Revolution and the shifts that that brought in. Because I think the Industrial Revolution led us into a way of thinking that did put the so-called needs of the economy, that did put technology center stage, and everything else seemed to be subordinate to that. But that's the wrong way around. It ought to be people who are in charge, and it ought to be technology that is the servant. And people who are in charge, that ought to be the people as a whole, not just an elite. And the people as a whole, they ought to be thinking in terms of their descendants, the long term humanly, and they have to be thinking, we have to be thinking in terms of the ecosystem, the planet as a whole, the other beings who we share it with. These are big asks, and they're asks which lie outside much of what's central to our civilization. So I think there's a number of moments we could point to, and we could go a lot further back to look at the problematic nature of the way that we moved into a more agricultural existence. Much further back. But for
mm.
me, probably the single most significant inflection point is the start of the Industrial Revolution. That's where it's sometimes called the Great Acceleration really had its origins, and the Great Acceleration is what's brought us to the very difficult, uh, catastrophic moment, really, that we're entering into now.
What is so interesting when having this sort of space of, say, up to a century away from an event is sort of seeing how ideology runs away with itself, and how citizens start to become. Now, I don't know the philosophical terms for this. You'll be able to couch it in correct language for me, but how people become uh, people are sort of made in the image of the dominant ideology rather than continuing to
Yeah,
progress ideology in some way. I think a really good example of that is Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss and what they're doing to the British economy at the moment. It is
yeah,
just neoliberalism gone mad, so mad
yes,
that even other neoliberals around the world are sort of shocked by it. Um,
yeah,
and so, like, how does that happen? How does a paradigm take hold of a time, a moment in history to the extent that it starts to recursively produce citizens in a sense, rather than
yeah,
citizens still
yeah,
having some sort of hand on the wheel.
yeah, yeah. So the term which comes to mind here is the term hegemony, which is a term due to the
Mm,
uh, great Italian politician and philosopher Antonio Gramsci. When you get ideological hegemony, when you get one particular ideology that becomes so dominant that it becomes assumed, that it becomes taken for granted, people can't even see it anymore, then people have less freedom because they are not free with regard to this ideology that's in effect controlling their thoughts. And we've been moving into a
mm,
period where neoliberalism has been ideologically hegemonic. The extreme version of neoliberalism that we're seeing now in Truss and Kwarteng and so on, well, this arguably is neoliberalism itself. This is always where it was supposed to
mm,
be heading, that these people are implementing the dreams of the people who founded neoliberalism a couple of generations ago, people like Hayek and some of his supporters, Friedrich Hayek. So yes, it's extreme, but it is actually the heart of the ideology itself. And we've been able to get to this point because increasingly the kind of assumptions neoliberals make have been taken for granted. And it's really crucial to be clear, of course, that these assumptions don't just end up putting us in a very parlous state economically. They do so ecologically as well, and so it's no coincidence that among the earliest moves that the Truss government is making is really ripping up most of our planning controls across half of the country. And this is why they've infuriated the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB. I mean, these are not radical organizations. These are part of what I call the old moderate flank. These are very mainstream organizations, very kind of middle England organizations. And they are furious, more furious than they've ever been before, because this extreme, but actually I'm suggesting just sort of, if you will, pure neoliberal government is doing stuff which is really terrifying from an ecological perspective, from an animal's perspective, etc.
Is it is it pure though? I mean, because Hayek and Friedman both also advocated for some government regulation. They did not advocate for a completely deregulated market in the way that we're seeing. And their neoliberalism, which is kind of, neoclassicism, was also being developed at a time where maybe perhaps we can't know this, right? But perhaps it was unimaginable to them at that moment to think about how low taxes could come, for example. So are we really seeing sort of their dreams implemented? Or is it possible that the ideology has uh, become a recursive, amplified monster of that original school of thought?
Well, look, I think the really important thing to understand is that when neoliberalism was dreamt up and begun to exist on an intellectual level, which is basically after the
Mm.
Second World War with the Montpellerian Society and so forth. People can look into this history if they want. It was a very extreme point of view, which was miles away from what was then the consensus. And its advocates tried tirelessly over many years to make it hegemonic. And it took a long time, really, before they got anywhere at all. It was a generation before they got anywhere at all. And then over the next generation, they really got somewhere with getting into power. People like Thatcher and Reagan. The hegemony then became such that former socialist parties, such as in the UK, the Labour Party, became effectively neoliberal parties in their fundamental
Mm.
outlook. So then it was more or less dominating the sort of electable political spectrum, outside of which you had people on the left of the Labour Party and the emerging Green Party. Um, and now you've got to the stage where in a fairly pure form, obviously we can debate whether there'd be things that Truss and Quarting are doing that Hayek or Friedman wouldn't like. In a fairly pure form, there's been an attempt to implement it. And we've seen economically how catastrophic that attempt is over the last week. We're literally recording at a time
Mm.
when the UK economy is in turmoil because a fairly pure form of neoliberalism has been put into operation. And we will see over the next year or so whether there are really horrendous consequences for nature in the UK. And
Mm.
depending on what happens, I think there may well be. But what one needs to understand is this was an absolutely deliberate, very thoughtful, if you will, program that was very carefully implemented, designed to achieve eventual ideological hegemony. My take, and the take I think of a lot of people now, is that all reasonable people and moderate people and sensible people, never mind people who are socialists or ecologically minded at a deep level or whatever, should be rising up as the RSPB and others are seeking to do to
Mm.
resist this extreme ideological maneuver that has been made. But we should also take a lesson from the neoliberals. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating irony that while neoliberalism is designed in such a way that it's liable to have very negative consequences for the long-term ecology, etc., of anywhere where it's implemented, it itself was designed in a long-termist way. I mean, to achieve its objectives over a period of generations.
Mm.
That's real that's far, far deeper thinking than one usually gets in politics. And well, we, and I mean we in quite a broad sense, as I've said here, we need to be thinking in a similar way. How do we go about starting to change challenge the hegemony and starting to change it and starting to plan for a future for our children, for our grandchildren, for our great grandchildren. That is the great challenge. But as I've been implying, it's really something which is or should be an incredibly mainstream and commonsensical point of view. Everybody cares about their children having a decent life. And that means they care about their grandchildren and their great grandchildren and their great great grandchildren having a decent life. So this is why perhaps this can be a hopeful moment, that the kind of shift that we're talking about here, which is very, very far away from where the UK government in particular is right now, is one which should be and can be, and I think is, deeply and widely appealing to a broad spectrum of people.
Yes, well, fingers crossed. And yet, is the
Mm.
problem not the appeal, but whether or not we will act? Um, it is
Uh,
something that
yeah,
my friends and I talk about quite regularly. We were speaking about it even in the office yesterday. Why are we not out on the streets? Why are we not doing something? It
yeah.
is mad. It
Hmm.
is mad what is happening, and it is mad that we still there's a part of us that recognizes what is happening and yet still doesn't seem to feel the need to do something about it, as if there's still this belief that, well, it must right itself eventually. Um,
Mm.
is what has happened there? Is that our kind of spoiled nature of living in a genuine democracy? Yeah, let's not debate those terms. But living in a privileged democracy for so long, is it that it is a crisis of imagination? Is it that
Yeah.
capitalism, neoliberalism, these hegemonies have just burrowed so deeply in our brain? Why are we not out on the streets? How do we get people to act?
Well, what a great question. So, so important. It's what myself and colleagues have been puzzling about, working on for a while now. Let me attempt an answer by beginning
Mm,
with this. Yeah, I think the factors you mention are relevant, but I think there are other factors as well. So, one really important factor is, and perhaps you alluded to this when you mentioned a crisis of imagination. I think people are still mostly not clear um, about how bad the situation is and about how much worse it's likely to get. I'm talking here about the climate and ecological situation.
mm,
And we need to help people with that. You mentioned earlier my counterfactual history project, my what if project. I'm trying to imagine how the past
mm,
might have been different. Um, and I'm imagining pasts that could have gone a lot better, and also in some cases, pasts that could have gone a lot worse. So, what if, on the one hand, here's a really wild, massive one. What if those who assassinated Caesar had won out over Mark Antony and so on, and there had never been
mm,
a full blown Roman Empire? And how might that have transformed history? Um, a much more recent one. What if the democratic result of the 2000 election had gone through and Al Gore was elected US president?
mm,
The election was stolen from him. That became very clear in the months
mm,
after the election due to freedom of information requests. What if we had had Gore rather than Bush? A negative
mm,
scenario. What if our fridges had been differently designed so that for coolants, instead of CFCs, they used bromine, which was entirely possible that could have happened. It sounds incredibly
mm,
technical. People will be aware probably that CFCs are what caused the ozone hole, which was eventually more or less fixed by brilliant international action. bromine is a lot more damaging to the ozone layer than CFCs. If bromine had been used in fridges rather than CFCs, the destruction to the ozone hole could have been so bad before anyone realized what was happening that it would have been pretty much irreparable. I think it's really worth thinking about how the past could have been different, because it gives us a sense of our contingency. It gives us a sense of sometimes how we've been lucky or unlucky to get where we are. And it gives us a sense of our agency. And that's even more important. People made decisions, that made things go in one direction rather than another. And those decisions could have been made differently. And we're at the exact same situation, of course, now, right? What we so badly need now is a sense of our own agency. And that agency is, of course, constrained. And that's one of the reasons, as you implied, why people struggle sometimes to act as they need to, as we should. But it is also real, and I believe it is far realer and huger than most people imagine. I think we've got a little bit of a sense of that, a little bit of a hint of that in the last few years with the amazing upsurges of Extinction Rebellion and the school climate strikes, which have altered our consciousness and our trajectory on climate. Although if they'd have been bigger, they would have altered it a lot more. So that's what we need. We need something that's a lot bigger. Now, let's go a bit more deeply into why it isn't happening. As I mentioned a minute ago, I think people haven't been told really how bad the situation is, and they haven't been shown how much better it could be. One of the things which I think is hugely important here is the potential role of the arts and entertainment. And I think that they're only just starting to rise to this challenge. A film like Don't Look Up, for example, really, really impressive that it had such a success. But as well as dystopias, we need what I call through-topias. We need pictures of how we're going to get through what's coming and how we could get through it into a place that could, on balance, be better. There isn't going to be a utopian future. That not everything is going to be wonderful and brilliant. We've damaged far too much for us to be able to inhabit such a utopia in the future. But we could have a through-topia. We could have a society which in many ways is better than what we have right now. We'll only have it if we rise up to the full power of our agency. We'll only do that if we really focus on how dire the future is going to be if we don't act, and on how, well, pretty good it could be if we do. If we do the kind of thing that XR did and that Greta started to do, made possible. But if we do it at much more scale. Now, how's that going to happen? That's why my colleagues and I are working on trying to deliver, trying to bring to the world what is already starting to happen, what I call the moderate flank, the emerging new moderate flank. That's what we need. We need people to get active in ways that, because many people are not going to do the kind of thing that XR asked them to do. Most people are not going to do that, at least not until things get a lot worse. But we need many more people to get active in their workplaces, in their communities where they live, also where they pray, where in politics as well, of course. We need people to come into the full power of their agency, which they'll only do if they're shown the full truth of where they're at and the full truth of where they could be in the future if we were to make a change in the right direction. Now, with the cost of living crisis, with this extreme government that we have now in the UK, I think that we will start to see people taking a lot more action and resisting than has been the case in the last couple of years. The question is, will it be enough? And that depends on whether enough people get involved in response to this kind of thinking and invitation. And the really crucial question, of course, is, will it be sufficiently long-termist? Will it be sufficiently deep from an eco perspective? Will it be really serious about taking on the climate crisis? Because all these crises are connected, but unless we see that and act on it and are serious about it, unless we think beyond our own short-term interests, unless we think beyond, for example, merely I want a warm house this winter, no matter what, unless we realize the way these things are joined up and the way that we have to use this as a profound opportunity to move in the direction we know we need to move in, the direction, for example, in relation to our homes, of much greater insulation, much greater installation of renewable energy. Unless we act directly to do that, and act to pressure the political system to do that at the same time, unless we do that, then we will continue on what is, on balance, a really terrifying trajectory. But it does not have to be that way. And that is why I think we are at a potential hopeful moment of inflection, as well as a very dark and difficult moment.
Mhm. I agree. I think that this could be the moment, certainly in the UK, where people have enough. Um, there
Mm,
is literally a campaign called "Enough is Enough," and
yeah.
it is very exciting to see multiple campaigns popping up and people just speaking in a far more politically literate and emotional language than we have seen for a
Yes.
while. The
Yes.
Like, if things have gotten so bad, people are almost not despondent anymore. They've somehow gone back to furious. But there's a couple of
Yes.
things in what you said that I want to pause on and get into. You said that if we
Sure.
show people the truth, um, uh, is that true though? Because how does this not go back to sort of the hegemony, right? When you have a hegemony, let's say that, for example, society cannot collapse because it is so unimaginable. Um,
Mm,
that our way of life is the correct way of life, or it's just the way of life that we know and would like to continue. When you have such deep rooted hegemonies, and also it is typically very difficult, we've seen that throughout human history, for citizens to be aware of an existential threat. Is it that showing
mm,
them the truth is enough, or how do we communicate the truth in a way that is effective?
yeah.
Or what kind of stories do we need to build to communicate that truth? It seems to me that actually facts and realities and messaging are really falling short of the task in front of us because the truth is not enough when up against people's desires, fears, and held cultural beliefs.
Mm, mm. Yeah, so look, it depends what you mean by the truth, right? If you mean
Mm,
simply some kind of narrow, cold, factive version of where we're at and where we're going, yeah, that's not enough. What we need a clear picture of where we are and where we're going. So that requires, for example, acknowledging um, that the situation in terms of the COPs, the climate COPs, is much worse than most
mm,
people realize. These COPs, the COP system,
mm,
arguably was designed to fail, unlike the system brought in to deal with
mm.
the threat to the ozone layer. Neoliberals around the
But
world made sure that that the COP system was not did not have any legal sanctions in it and was an essentially voluntary system, which is never going to succeed in dealing with a situation like this. Um, we're not going to stay
could you
below
speak more on
1.5
that,
degrees.
Rupert?
So just to explain what I mean by that a little bit more, and this is a controversial view, but I think it's true, and it partly came home to me being at COP26 in Glasgow last year and talking with people who'd been in the system for a long time. The COP system, at the end of the day, is a sort of gigantic international talking shop. I mean, that really is what it is. And you saw that, I think, quite clearly
Mhm,
in what came out of COP26, which was the big thing that came out of COP26 that everyone was so excited about. It was, we're going to move from 5 yearly plans to 1 yearly plans. But they're all just still plans, and all they devolve down
mhm,
to is voluntary commitments by national governments, which are, you might say, better
mhm,
than nothing, but they're not a lot better than nothing. I mean, what is a commitment
mhm,
from a government, and from a bunch of politicians who could be voted out, etc.? What is it
yeah,
worth if it's not backed up by anything? Right? So with the Montreal
mm,
Protocol that tackled the ozone crisis in the 80s, that agreement had teeth. It was enforceable. There's no enforceability to the UNFCCC agreements, the UN system, which is the basis of the COP system, and that arguably was a deliberate choice
mhm,
by neoliberals who saw what happened in response to the ozone crisis, and they said, "Well, we can't have that again. We can't have some international agreement which is going to limit economic activity. So we're not going to. We're going to make sure that the COP system is toothless. So partly because the COP system is toothless, we are not going to stay below 1.5 degrees of global overheat. That is a key part of the truth. Again, that's a controversial view, but it's increasingly entering the open air. People are getting fed up, to be frank, with the kind of so-called stubborn optimism approach that says, no, we're going to do it. We're going to make the Paris Agreement. We're going to come through. We're going to save the world. We're going to stay below 1.5 degrees of global overheat. It's not true. It's not going to happen. This is an awful realization. It is a terrible betrayal. 1.5 is a proxy for staying safe, and we are not going to stay safe. I mean, we're already not safe, right? We're already in the age of consequences, especially in the global south. But that is going to get worse for a long time to come. So we need these dark truths. We need them, as you imply, to be communicated not just in plain factual ways, but in emotional ways. People need to understand and need to hear the profound concern in the voice of someone like myself who's saying this. People need to hear parents talking about this, scientists talking about it. I don't know if you saw the Breaking Boundaries program that David Attenborough, Johan Rockstrom did on Netflix last year, I think it was. Very, very impressive program. The reason it was most impressive, in my view, is because you had scientists breaking down in tears while they were being filmed when they were asked about, what their research shows, what they think the future is going to be like. That's the kind of thing that people need. Not just hearing scientists make very worrying predictions, but hearing something which is actually congruent with those predictions in the voices of those scientists. Real deep concern, grief, fear, anger, as you say. These are the kind of things that we need. And of course, this ties in with what you mentioned and what I mentioned before. It's got to be about stories as well, right? We need to have pictures painted of alternative possible futures. This is what the world will look like if we carry on the path we are on. This is what the world will look like if we don't. In various different scenarios. It's obviously never as simple as just a binary. And we need to be clear that if we manage to start making a course correction, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be okay. Like I say, we are in the age of consequences. Things are already not okay. They're going to carry on getting worse for quite a while to come. That truth needs to be understood. And we need to understand that it is still, that we are still in time to prevent the worst consequences that could come. And that the difference between the two is astronomical. It's a difference between, crucially, for instance, a society that probably collapses and one that doesn't, one that struggles through. Yeah. And if we care about our children, and that's what we all care about, right? What we all want is a decent future for our children, in my case for our nephews and nieces, and so on and so forth. We all want that. We know what that means. We know what that means in terms of the kind of things we have to do. And what I mean by the kinds of things we have to do, that includes what we were talking about a few minutes ago. It includes changing your life, right? It includes getting involved. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to glue yourself to a motorway. It doesn't necessarily mean you even have to become an activist. But it does mean that every single person who wakes up to this reality has to reassess their life and think, what am I doing to place myself in a good position to be able to look my kids in the eye in 20 or 30 years' time, say, and say, I'm proud that I did what I could. I'm proud I did everything that I could. I'm proud that I operated in the places where I could have the most impact to make a change. And whether or not that effort has been successful, what everyone needs is to reorganize their life and their priorities so they're able to answer that question truthfully. I'm proud of what I did. I'm proud of the massive difference I made in my profession, for example. Or I'm proud of the fact that I gave away £100,000 to the cause, or something like that. It's not enough anymore to think, well, I've got a standing order to Greenpeace. What more do you want of me? If people have, and of course, lots of people still have substantial amounts of money in their bank account, or a second home or whatever. You need to be thinking, is this really what I want to be doing with my wealth? Is this really the best thing I could be doing with it? A lot of this wealth is going to be worthless unless we have a major societal course correction. So,
Mm.
put that money now into something which could actually be useful. People don't realize, for example, that a crucial factor in the ability of Extinction Rebellion to do what we did um, when we launched in 2018, there was that we had a very substantial initial donation from a businessman who was like, "Yeah, I want to give some power to your elbow and see if you can force a national
Mm.
conversation and change the status quo around climate consciousness." And thank goodness he did that, because he
Mhm.
made a huge difference to our ability to really get started and really start to break through, as in
Mhm.
2019 we did, where so many people hadn't broken through before. But now what is needed is for a
Mhm.
much wider, larger mobilization. Like I say, it's the radical flank did brilliant work in 2019. It's time now for a mass moderate flank, and every person of good conscience needs to be a part of it. And if we are, then untold things are possible. You look at what XR or Fridays for Future achieved. Multiply that by 100. That's what we need to do, and that's what is entirely possible to do. Because be sure of one thing: these the climate issue is not an issue. It's so much bigger than that. It is a whole new condition of existence. It's permanent. It is going to carry on getting worse for a considerable time. And one of the things that means is there will be more climate activism. There will be much more climate action in the 2020s. It is inevitable that this is going to grow. The question is, are you going to be a part of it? Is it going to grow enough? In what direction is it going to grow? Is it going to be maximally effective? These are the kinds of questions that we need to be stepping up to now.
I agree. I think I think part of the problem is that people don't know where to step up to. I find
Hmm.
I find something about the climate movement to me is fascinating in that it is still so fragmented. I increasingly see sort of how climate agents and actors like pop up in similar networks doing really really great work, and from the inside you can see, oh yeah, there is actually a network of people in the United Kingdom, for example, that are working very very hard to move the needle. um but from the outside it is difficult to kind of understand where to go, what to do,
Hmm.
who to speak with. um
Yeah.
I think if a lot of people, if they had a spare 100,000, they'd be like, but I do not know who to give it to, apart from, say, Greenpeace. Is Greenpeace doing the kind of action that we need now? I actually don't know enough about the organization. I would say donate to their newsroom as a journalist. Unearthed, I think it's fantastic. Um,
Yes, they're
but
very good.
to me, it's they are really great. But to me, it's not just the fact that people are disempowered or we need to step up to our agency. There seems to be no roadmap really for what to do. And part of the problem, of course, is that all of the attention in the press has been focused on these sort of disobedient actions like gluing oneself to
Yes.
things or breaking windows or whatever. And lots of
Yes.
people don't want to get involved with that, understandably so. But where do people go? How do we how do I put this? Not centralize like the movement, because part of a resilient ecosystem is its diversity, and we need
Yeah.
to keep the climate movement sort of decentralized in order so that it can continue to resist power. Um, and yet I feel like we need, big flashing arrows all
Yeah.
over the country and in the internet to show people where to go and what to do. Even I am not sure, and I'm pretty deeply involved in it at this stage.
Yeah.
Um, so the mass moderate flank. Let's get into the language of that as well in a minute. But are we? How do? What is the question?
Well, because I mean, the way I'm inclined to respond is by trying to talk about some real examples. Some of what we've been saying may be a bit
Hmm.
abstract to some viewers and listeners thus far. The way I envisage this emerging mass moderate flank, um, it's not going to be centralized. It's going to be quite bottom up and quite diverse. It's going to be popping up all over the place. So let's talk about some of those things that are already starting to pop up. You may be aware of the emerging network of climate emergency centers, for example. I think this is a really kind of hopeful and accessible development. Climate emergency centers spring up in towns, cities, parts of the countryside, even all over the country. They're sort of one-stop shops for people to think about how to get involved in mitigation and adaptation to the crisis situation that we're in, and they're very kind of they're very grassroots. You can support them in the particular places where they are. You can support them with your time. You can support them with your money. I have this phrase in my book, Parents for a Future: your money or your life. Choose to give one or the other to the cause. And if there isn't one where you live or near where you live, well, then you can start one. And that's what people are doing. What they're doing is they're taking over vacant buildings, and they're maintaining them and using them for this purpose. And they get a 100% council tax reduction for doing that. Basically, if there are vacant buildings, councils don't want them to fall into disrepair. They don't want them to fall into disrepair. So people, for these kinds of non-profit purposes, can use them to do good things in, and it doesn't cost a dime. Turning to workplaces, which I think is an absolutely crucial locale for what we're talking about. In advertising, there's an organization called Purpose Disruptors. If you're an ad man, how can you put those dark arts to a good cause? Well, Purpose Disruptors are doing it, as are Clean Creatives. In the legal profession, Lawyers for Net Zero is a very exciting development, trying to get lawyers to act in the corporations where they work, to turn those corporations in a better direction. And also, of course, in the legal field, you've got organizations like Client Earth, which are taking on governments and corporations and so forth, taking them on in the courtroom and winning. And people who are lawyers can do pro bono work for Client Earth or other similar organizations and make a massive difference in that way. Here's a really fascinating, bold example. There's an organization called Safe Landing, which is airline pilots and others in the airline industry challenging the climate disastrous nature of their own industry and saying, look, we need a transition plan here, which among other things is going to involve in the future creating a smaller airline industry, because all this stuff about jet zero and carbon free flying and so on is basically for the birds, at least for the moment. There's going to have to be a significant reduction in flying if we're going to not devastate our climate a lot more. So you might think, well, airline pilots, so there's nothing they can do. They're stuck in this terrible job, terrible for the climate. Well, Safe Landing are trying to do something about that. It's a brilliant name as well, I think. Safe Landing. It's multiple meanings. So these are just some examples. There are many more I could give of things like this that are emerging. And the organization I founded, the Moderate Flank Incubator, aims to support them and to do kind of thought leadership around this, and to do podcasts like this and so on and so forth. And in our own case, we are able to exist and do meaningful stuff because of a couple of very large donations. One 5-figure donation, one 6-figure donation, which enabled a bunch of us to really get going on trying to support these emerging organizations and trying to help it be the case that there is somewhere for people to go. I think you're right. What people want to know is what should I do? What is most effective? And what I say to them is, where you work or where you live or where you pray, there's going to be somewhere in your life where there's a huge change to be made, which can involve a lot of people. And maybe it's already happening, in which case join it and support it. And maybe it's not, in which case co-create it. and that's what people are doing all across these fields and areas and many more. It's an exciting time to be alive and to be a thinking person at this time. It's a terrifying time and an awesome time and an exciting time. It's an incredible opportunity to be around these things as they come into being. So that's what I would say. Anyone who's kind of thinking, oh yeah, well, I've been wondering about this for a while. How do I kind of reach a conclusion? Well, just make sure that the wandering doesn't last your whole life. Maybe you need a few more weeks or a few more months, and that's absolutely fine. But sooner or later, start to commit yourself and take action in one of these spheres and be confident that this is going to grow and grow, because it is, right? That is inevitable. That is inevitable because of the times that we are in and the waking up that is happening. The question is only, will it come soon enough to avoid some of the worst impacts? Will it happen at enough scale? And the answer partly depends on us. So it's a big invitation to agency, based in the truth, based in the reality that there is support for this, and based in the exciting broader reality that there's going to be more and more of this. And as people look around and see more of it, then they'll join in with it as well. So we can get then into a kind of virtuous circle, rather than a vicious circle, a virtuous circle of kind of hope and action and possibility and commitment, all kind of supporting each other and growing.
Wonderful. What a lovely,
Yeah.
wonderful call to action and vision. Thank you so much, Rupert. I was wondering if here towards the end of the episode, if
Yeah.
you spoke about through-topias and, we can't have a utopian vision, but because you were obviously so creative and you're writing these counter-histories, do you think you could surmise a hopeful vision for the future whereby
Mm.
even though we may have overshot 1.5,
Yeah.
we didn't hit 2, we managed to keep it to 1.6 or 1.7.
Yeah.
We have done away with neoliberalism. Like what could the
Yeah.
future look like if everybody acted?
Yeah. Well, you started to sketch it there. Yeah. What we need is we need realistic visions of a future where things are going to be very tough, but also things could be better. And yeah, that's part of what I mean by through-topia. We don't want a utopia that just feels unreal to people and is frankly unreal. But we can have visions of a future which is net better. So to expand on that a little bit more, what could it be like? What may it be like? I think it is certain that the future will be more local. It might not happen immediately, but the longer we delay in having a more local future, the more likely it is that it ends up being hyperlocal in the worst sense. In other words, after a collapse, things are a lot more local, right? So the future is going to be more local. It's either going to be more local because there's going to be collapse events, or it's going to be more local because we've chosen to make it more local. So there will be less dependence on long, uncertain international supply lines that are very carbon heavy. There will be more dependence on, for example, seasonal vegetables. In the future, you won't be eating so many tomatoes from Holland or Spain. You'll probably be eating rather more apples from Kent and Norfolk, and so on and so forth. The future is going to be one in which there is more security, in which there is less uncertainty. That is a place we can get to. It's not going to come quickly, but I think it could eventually come. Because if we start to have a future which is not fixated on endless economic growth, a future which is more local, a future which is more intent upon preserving nature, on rewilding. And rewilding is going to be an ongoing phenomenon for sure, also over the next decade and more. A future where we are more aware of and take more seriously that our soils are alive, and they're not just dead bits of sand and dust and so on, in which we stick our crops. Once these kinds of things start happening, then the kind of chronic uncertainty that we're currently in will become a bit less chronic. And you mentioned earlier, well, can people really think collapse? Is it so far outside the conventional frames of society? The thing is, it's becoming easier and easier, tragically, for people to think it and imagine it. And it's very interesting when you look at opinion polls, what opinion polls say about this. They say that actually loads of people are contemplating it privately. The future will be one in which these things are more out in the open, in which our fears are more out in the open. And the more they come out into the open, the more we're able to act on them, and the more we're able to stop them from becoming reality. So I think the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to see a lot more truth and frank facing of where we are. And that can feed into a future where we actually, over time, have less chance of the direst realities becoming, the direst possible realities becoming actual, more security, more of a sense of ourselves as having a kind of a reasonable chance of having a reasonably long tenure on Earth as inhabitants and stewards, rather than fantasizing ourselves as some kind of masters or overlords. So that's a kind of rough outline of how things could be. We need to imagine how the past could have been different. We need, crucially, to imagine how the future could be different. We need to do that ourselves. We need especially artists, storytellers, etc., to do it. And we need to imagine both bad futures and decent futures like that. And that is something which so far the arts and the entertainment world has been quite poor on, imagining and depicting these kinds of through-topias, the kind of thing that for the last 4 or 5 minutes I've been kind of going on about some of what the broad outlines might be like. That's one of the reasons why right now I myself and others in the Moderate Flank Initiative are working with filmmakers and artists and dramatists and writers and trying to co-create some of these through-topias, trying to give people this sense of agency between a future which is increasingly bad and a future which is really challenging, but in which we come through to be in some ways better off than we are right now, more secure, better nourished, less chronically uncertain, with a better sense of community and so forth. It really is attainable.
Rupert, thank you so much. I believe it, and I want all of our listeners to believe it as well. I think what is so
Great.
important to note is there are so many people who are working very, 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 very hard. If you want to go out and join the cause, you will not be alone. I'm sorry it's not easier
Yes.
to find us. If you're listening to this and this is the first time maybe you've heard of some of these things, like we are working on it, but you are not alone. If you want to go out and get involved, there's a whole community waiting for you, and things are moving very, very, very quickly. Rupert, thank you so much for your time today. This has been absolutely fascinating. My final question, of course, is who would you like to platform?
Yes, I've been giving this
to
some thought,
Rupert.
and I would suggest David Wallace Wells. He is someone who I've known for a few years now. He became famous in our part of the world, if you will, through his article, which then became a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. And what's interesting about David is he's really got his finger on the pulse of trends towards things getting very, very bad. But he also, like me, has some, and like most of us actually, has some active hope and determination to make the future a better place and prevent these dark possibilities from becoming a reality. He's incredibly well informed, including about the kind of movements we've been talking about. So yeah, he'd be a great person to have on if you can get him.
Great. Wonderful. Rupert, thank you so
Cool.
much for your time. This has just been magic. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, I
Yes.
can't wait to share it with you when it comes out. I'll let you know.
I'll look forward to that.
If you want to learn more about Rupert's work, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon, where you can also read my weekly essays inspired by each podcast interview. The Patreon link is in the description box below. As always, thank you to the Planet Critical community who support the show and make all of this work possible. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you next week.